What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Welcome to episode 2, and this is Mark Russell.
This is Charles Figley.
And we're here to talk a little bit about military mental health care and how we can introduce that topic in our book, Psychiatric Casualties. And we'll be covering some things out of that as well as anything else that comes up. So one of the things that we start with is a quote. I love this quote because it's something I came across when I was doing my doctoral dissertation in the 1990 timeframe or something like that. And it's from the Second World War, 2 Army colonels, Apple and Beebe, and they quote, "Each moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their exposure. Thus, psychiatric casualties are as inevitable as gunshot and shrapnel wounds in warfare." And they made that quote because they were tasked by the War Department, as it was called back then, to investigate an epidemic in psychiatric casualties during the Second World War that they had not anticipated. In fact, did everything they can to prevent and failed. And we're trying to go back and understand why that policy failed, which we'll be talking about, today, this episode and future episodes too. But that phrase always stuck with me about the inevitability that, you could be killed in war, that you could be wounded in war, and yes, you could have psychiatric wounds, and those things are all predictable outcomes anytime we go to war.
And this was the best kept secret. I mean, the military has done their best to stay right on course.
Absolutely. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe at the time that they published their investigation, it was classified. So it wasn't meant to be publicly disclosed. And that's the other thing, what we uncovered in our 10 years of researching the topic of military mental health care and war stress, that a number of documents that were classified at the time became declassified. So we'll be pulling out from that, again, that most general public doesn't know, most people in the military are not aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually the book is full of those, and thanks to you. I mean, you basically forced the military to give you documents, right?
There's been some Freedom of Information Act gain, but also just a lot of research and, trying to find articles and as obscure and, going back to the American Revolution, the Spanish-American War, Napoleonic Wars. So, so it was really kind of a broad stretch of how long have we as human beings had to deal with war stress and, war stress, what we use as war stress injuries, the effects of war. And, and so this trying to understand the historical precedents that existed and why were we struggling in the 21st century to do, a modicum of what we should be doing. And talking about learning the lessons of war, a famous quote by the Spanish philosopher George Santa Anna, which is often, people probably have heard of that. This quote is, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," is really gets to the heart of what military mental health care and the journey that has taken full over generations, is that we constantly don't learn our historical lessons and are doomed to repeat it.
Yep.
So just to read a little bit about the Department of the Army has a doctrine on lessons to learn. And this is coming from what they describe as the importance of that and what they systematically, how they go about learning the lessons of war. And they say it's a doctrine for organization, research, development, acquisition, training, planning, and other appropriate activities Its lessons learned programs, it creates a system to serve in both peace and wartime as the focal point for the collection, analysis, dissemination, and implementation of combat relevant lessons learned, which will enhance the Army's ability to perform its missions. Right? And each service, the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, now Space Force, has their own policies and dedicated centers for lessons learned. And each medical department has its own dedicated programs, policies, and personnel to learn the medical lessons of war. So there's one for the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, Marine Corps. Right. So there's a big emphasis on the importance of learning lessons, which we think is kind of important too, right?
Yeah, I was waiting for the conjunction, however, or on the other hand, or
Well,
unfortunately,
there's a big however. When it comes to mental health, the mental health lessons are kind of fall under medicine. So military medicine is responsible, and the surgeon generals are the heads of military medicine, are responsible for including mental health lessons learned as well. We don't do so well at that. Yeah.
No, we hire nurses or pay nurses or help nurses dress up. And what was it that you were talking about, dressing up as superheroes?
Oh, goodness.
I
Yeah.
mean, how in the hell can you take it seriously if
Well,
commanders are enabling making fun of it?
right.
I mean, laughter is always therapeutic, but not necessarily when you don't pay attention to the major symptoms that's affecting your troops.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
what
yeah.
are they thinking? What were they thinking?
Well, let me just include what you're referring to. And it's comical, but it was the beginning of my fuse being lit. Is we're at Navy Hospital Bremerton, about to deploy a field hospital and provision to serve the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So we go to Camp Pendleton, right, my old stomping grounds, where I used to live, and
As a kid.
As a kid. Now I'm going back as a Navy. I think at that time I was a lieutenant commander and head of the neuropsychiatry department. So I was head of mental health for this field hospital. And we had a psychiatrist and social workers and psychiatric nurse and enlisted corpsmen who were psychiatric technicians, all part of this department as we're ready to deploy in the invasion of Iraq. And if you remember back in when they're talking about going into Iraq, a lot of concern about nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And we're invading a sovereign country. It's not like the first Gulf War where we're liberating Kuwait, which was pretty much a snap generally. But in here, we're going to go invade a homeland, and with a very large and well-armed military, the Iraqis, who we supplied a lot of their arms to. So we were expecting mass casualties in this invasion, similar to when we invaded, the islands Japan occupied in World War II, or D-Day when we were invading France. We were expecting a large number of casualties, especially if biochemical nuclear weapons were employed. So along with that should have been this recognition from Apple and Beebe's quote that we should expect large numbers of psychiatric casualties too in this mass invasion, right? Well, we're at this field hospital and a tent hospital, and there are simulating the sounds of war, and the sounds, the sights, there's gunfire, there's artillery blasts, they're bringing in a helicopter in casualties like out of a MASH unit, right? And they were very realistic. It was Hollywood at its best. I mean, I was really impressed on the realism of some of the injuries, the physical injuries that people were being brought in to our tent hospital with. And, the docs, the nurses, the corpsmen, everybody's responding, in a sense of urgency and a realism, because we know in a couple of months we're going to be deployed, and we're going to probably be doing this for real, right? And so I'm waiting with my team at the triage center for the first psychiatric casualties to emerge. This is where you were talking about the comic book character. Well, it took hours into this exercise, and I started getting impatient. I went up to our commanding officer of the hospital and I said, "Sir, where's psychiatric casualties? All of our people are waiting so we can start to practice, because we've been doing some training and we want to do some of this preparation before we actually go into Iraq." And he said, "Well, hang on tight, Russell. They're coming. We were told they're coming." I said, "Okay." So about an hour later, again, 3 hours into this exercise, we get our first call to come to the triage center, and that is a distress Marine Lance Corporal, a female Lance Corporal, who was wearing a cape and a mask and had this little label attached to her uniform that said Batgirl. And that was our one and only psychiatric casualty that we were to practice on in preparation to go to war. And yeah, that was eye-opening.
Very sad, very frustrating.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And incredibly disrespectful. And
yeah,
I think people that are listening to this are wondering, is that going along? Is that the level of sophistication of the military these days, in which they're laughing at these things? They're not providing the opportunity to train and to be prepared for these kinds of psychiatric.
Yeah, and I can't speak for all the different trainings, like what the Army might have done, the Air Force, and their field hospitals, but yeah, for a Navy field hospital, we're if not Batgirl, if Batgirl is only a one-off, okay, but the idea that what other level of training that we're getting across the board, and as I mentioned to you in our first episode, that first training survey we did, where we surveyed 111 uniform mental health providers, and we found 97% had admitted they were not properly trained in how to administer or deliver the top evidence-based treatments for PTSD. Where are we at with that now? And I haven't done a survey. I'm not in the uniform anymore, but I would hazard a guess. It might be improved but it's still not anything close to 90% trained, as it was 97% untrained back in 2004, 5, and 6.
Still can't get my hands around or my arms around or think about a commander who would do that. And maybe hoping that a little humor would help in morale, and it would take their minds off of some of the challenges in front of them, etc.
I don't think that's the deal.
Understand?
Yeah, I really honestly don't think it was a purposeful attempt to bring in humor. I think it was a very naive view of mental health in psychiatric casualties. Now I'll share with you why. Because then when we actually deployed the field hospital, and we're preparing for that invasion, I think it's in February or whatever it was, we were there, and we set up our field hospital, all the tents, and everything was geared up. And then we had to go, and all the functional leaders, all the department heads, all met in the field with our senior medical officer to be assigned to which tent do we set up shop, right? And we're in a grassy field or a dirt field, whatever grass that was. And the senior medical officer standing on a box with a clipboard, and he's reading off, okay, surgery, tent 1, nursing ward 2, tent 2, ICU, or, tent 3, ER, triage room, tent 4, et cetera, et cetera. Each department was being called. And, they called the pastoral care, and they were set up right next to the morgue, and Father Trapani, our chaplain, was not real happy having his chapel being, right adjacent to the morgue. So he stood behind with me because I was the last person standing, literally. Everybody else went off with their teams to fill up their tents and get ready, because we're about to receive casualties any day. And here is neuropsychiatry standing alone. I'm saying, "Sir, what about mental health?" And he looks at his clipboard and he says, "Well, Russell, I don't see anything here for mental health." And to be honest with you, I don't even know why you're here. So I think that speaks more to what happened at Camp Pendleton.
Yeah.
It's just that ignorance and that lesson that Apple and Beebe spoke of in the Second World War about the inevitability of psychiatric casualties, large number of as predictable as shrapnel and other wounds of war.
We have a graph of that pretty early on. Yeah, right. This one.
Yeah, let's talk a little about that. So what that graph is that Charles is referring to is we went back to all the statistical records kept by the War Department, now known as Department of Defense, about psychiatric casualties in war. And this is the trend that we uncovered, is that in the Second World War, we started having more psychiatric casualties than the total wounded in action and killed in action combined. And I'm going to be nerded out. I'm going to give you some numbers here, right? So, for example, in the Second World War, a total of 1,076,245 U.S. personnel were either killed in action or wounded in action. In regards to psychiatric casualties, and this is primarily through the Army only, because the Navy Marine Corps kept very lousy stats. They didn't publish it. In the Army, 1,253,000 service members were admitted to psychiatric hospitals or received psychiatric care. Now, so that number eclipsed the total number of wounded in action, killed in action combined, right? What makes it more striking in the Second World War was an unprecedented large-scale social experiment where they tried to eradicate mental health problems, war stress injury from the military by screening out 1.6 million volunteers who had any type of predisposition to mental health issues or trauma-related stuff. So everything known, if you were from a divorced family, if you were adopted, if you stuttered, if your ears were lopsided. Yeah, I mean, any known vulnerability.
Racist.
Yeah, we screened them out. So basically, we went into the Second World War with a bunch of Captain Americas, the most psychiatrically and physically hardy and most screened military ever put on this earth. And yet there were more psychiatric casualties than there were physical casualties of war. And that's what prompted that War Department study that Apple and Beebe led to go investigate why. And they said, well, the reason why is because history has shown us that psychiatric casualties are inevitable in war. And they had to reverse that policy at that time. We'll talk more about that in a future episodes about what that policy exactly was and how that unfolded. But let's go to the 21st century, right? What I was sharing with you about my preparation to go in a field hospital in the invasion of Iraq. What did we do there? Well, that trend has lasted. That trend started in World War II, has persisted after every war since World War II, where psychiatric casualties outnumber the physical wounds of war. And in this 21st century, there were a total, and this is going back to maybe 2018, 2019. So these aren't current stats, but you get the general idea, right? And around 2018, there were a total of 58,586 U.S. Personnel who were killed in action or wounded in action. 58,586. In 2018, there was 936,283 military personnel that were identified as having some type of a psychiatric issue. 685,540 veterans diagnosed and treated in the VA for a psychiatric issue coming out of those wars. Far eclipse the physical wounds of war. So that idea of George Santayana about learning the lessons of war and being prepared, or if not learning it, we're going to be doomed to repeat it. Let's see, how does the military respond, right? I think You can probably get the idea. Not well,
Yeah.
right?
So,
So let's see. We in our earlier articles, Charles, we talked about something of a generational cycle, what we call preventable wartime crisis, wartime mental health crisis. And I don't know what are your thoughts about the idea of it being preventable?
preventable
Yeah.
within, I think it's definitely and absolutely preventable.
So if gunshot wounds and shrapnel and psychiatric casualties are inevitable outcomes of war, what makes this? How do we even think about preventing something? And I think what we're talking about is that you can't prevent psychiatric casualties, just like you can't prevent, shrapnel wounds and people being killed in war. That is the tragic outcome of war. But we use this sentence here that did we do our very best to implement what we knew we should be and should not be doing in order to avoid unnecessary harm? And the kind of idea of preventability is that, are we learning the lessons of war trauma? And are we doing it in a way that we did our very best to minimize, the predictable outcome? Well, there are going to be psychiatric casualties, but are we really doing our best to mitigate that, to reduce that? If we haven't, then we fail those lessons again, right? So I want to just walk through a little bit the idea of what each generation, we talk about generational crisis is what we uncovered. And I won't go through every one of these, but the first lesson learned, and that what happens after the war is the military will investigate and all aspects of warfare, the technology, the strategies, the different battles, in the case of medicine, how we dealt with the wounds of war, and then in mental health, how we dealt with the mental health wounds of war will be referred to as war stress injuries. So after each war, each generation has looked at how they did with the mental health side of war. And they document this in lessons learned volumes, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll start, they had one in World War I. I'll skip that and go to the Second World War because it references the First World War.
So as a result of that, then, every lesson learned should not be repeated.
That's the idea, right?
Obvious thing.
Yeah, well, that's the whole policy. As I read the Army doctrine on lessons learned, is that we analyze, we accumulate these lessons, and then we disseminate it, and then we implement it so that we have that as part of our DNA. And in military medicine, we referred to a little bit earlier that some of the innovations that have come from learning the battlefield lessons of war, the medical lessons, have been instrumental in transforming civilian care.
Yes.
So the whole idea about transfusions, ambulances and triage, all that started in the Civil War. You had treatments for malaria, all the things with cleanliness and sterilization, preventing medical disease, all that was born out of different military conflicts. Blood transfusions, treating burns, traumatic amputations, all those lessons from battlefield medicine translated to, the kind of amazing emergent care we get in the civilian sector, right? Mm-hmm. Those are clear benefits from learning the lessons. Now, statistically, there's a medical historian named Gabriel who wrote about this and looked at the survival rates today from people severely wounded, multiple amputations, severe burns. In today's battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan, 97% survivability rate amongst the most severely wounded. And Gabriel looks back at different eras, and he goes all the way back to, they estimate, in the era of Alexander the Great. So that's going back. So you're guesstimating. But based on medical lessons that they revealed from the Greeks then, that about 3% survived and often died from diseases and infections than the actual, being stabbed or shot or whatever happened, the direct wounds of war. So we have a 97% survivability rate, which really speaks to the benefit and the wisdom of why we have medical lessons learned programs, policies, and personnel dedicated to learn those lessons.
And so where's that same impeccable finding with regard to mental health?
Well, let's see what happened in the Second World War. All right. Which everybody, we have a very fond recollection of, the
heroes.
It was a just war. It was a war where we were heroes. And, that most people think of the Second World War generation as being psychologically hardy and resilient. And they came back not pretty well unaffected by the war's trauma, unlike today's generational warriors. That's the myth. Because as we just talked about, there were more psychiatric casualties in the Second World War than there were, those who were killed and wounded combined, right? So anyways, they did their analysis, the post-war analysis of the mental health lessons learned. This was the conclusions reached by these Army generals and leaders of military medicine. In retrospect, the concepts and practices as developed by combat psychiatry in World War II generally rediscovered, confirmed, and further elaborated upon the largely forgotten or ignored lessons learned by the Allied armies, including the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. So they admit it out front. We had to relearn everything, just like that admiral told us in that field hospital, right, in 2003. Very impressive, folks, but unfortunately will all be forgotten and will need to be rediscovered. Almost word for word. They go on to say, quote, thus, the lessons of World War II combat psychiatry should be regarded as relearned and consolidated insights. Further, and most important, there was the documented history of World War I, as well as accounts from other previous wars. In our book, we go, again, a lot of lessons learned from the American Civil War and other wars before the First World War, which provided abundant evidence that combat would produce large numbers of psychiatric casualties. As you can see, Apple and BB playing a role in that, right? Exactly what they concluded. They go on and say, just quote, despite the foregoing data that were available to responsible authorities, there was no effective plan or real preparation for the utilization of psychiatry by the Army in the World War II. And the same could be said about the Navy and Marine Corps as well. Quote, facilities for the care and treatment of psychiatric cases were only barely sufficient for the small peacetime Army. Quite a condemnation.
Yes.
Right? Where we were at and forgetting those lessons learned, right? We repeated Santa Anna's warning, did not heed it, and we failed. So let's jump forward, and we could go through each generation, which we do in our book.
Right.
They have similar conclusions, right? But let's jump forward to the 21st century and the recent war on terrorism, and specifically around Afghanistan, Iraq. In 2007, the Department of Task Force on Mental Health reported their findings after a year-long investigation into mental health care in the military. That 2007 investigation was mandated by Congress. It wasn't the Army deciding to do that proactively, which is typical. And it was prompted in part by my Department of Defense IG complaint against military medicine, which I forwarded to members of Congress, and helped inform that we need to really take a serious look at what's going on in the military. We have an epidemic of suicides, untreated veterans, and kind of a lot of problems when they leave the military. And so they went and did a year-long investigation, tri-service or a multi-service, let's say, investigation. Here's their conclusions. The task force arrived at a single finding underpinning all others. Quote, the military health system lacks the fiscal resources and the fully trained personnel to fulfill its mission to support psychological health in peacetime or fulfill the enhanced requirements imposed during times of conflict. Almost identical verbiage as the Second World War, right? We couldn't even provide adequate mental health during peacetime, yet alone war. They go on, the task force does go on and state, quote, the time for action is now. The human and financial costs of unaddressed problems will rise dramatically over time, which it has. Our nation learned this lesson at a tragic cost in the years following the Vietnam War. Fully investing in prevention, early intervention, and effective treatment are responsibilities incumbent upon us as we endeavor to fulfill our obligation to our military service members. There were 99 separate recommendations in that task force report. Most of them mirrored what I was recommending in the IG complaint that I filed in 2005. So here we are in 2007. This is 180 degrees different than what military leaders were testifying to Congress in the different variety of Armed Services Committee meetings, hearings, about how we were doing, groundbreaking work in mental health. And we had unprecedented level of access to the top military or top mental health treatments and well-trained providers, et cetera. All that was completely debunked by the task force's findings, made public. And what do you think happened in response? Well,
Sure.
Well, what do you think Congress did? And again, just in 2007, 1 month before the revealing of this report, the military leaders were still holding that line. And then 1 month later, they completely contradicted, like, no, we can't even provide adequate care in peacetime. What was the response, you think, from the media, from Congress, or the government? How would you think they would respond?
Well, I would think that they would respond. This is a tragedy. This is horrific.
Yeah.
Let's do something about it as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's outrageous. How dare you come up here 1 month early and tell us everything's fine? And now you come back and say it's just the opposite, right?
But no one asked that, right?
No, nobody asked. And the media didn't ask. In fact, the people who did the leaders, the surgeon generals, and who were on that task force, who are responsible themselves, because all that task force was led by the surgeon generals for the head military medicine, and they were all awarded for it. After this task force, they got awarded. They were applauded as providing a groundbreaking, being so transparent, et cetera, et cetera. And the press didn't follow up on it. No hard questions were asked. Well, why now? We started the invasion in 2001. This is 2007. Why didn't we do something earlier? How did this happen?
Did anything like that come out of this?
No, sir. Not a single negative thing. It was all heralded as groundbreaking and positive. And people were applauded, and they applauded themselves on the back. No outrage from the public, no outrage from the media, no outrage from Congress, certainly not from the government, and not from the military. Military that thought they did something really great.
By admitting the problem?
Yeah, by admitting that we failed to adhere to the lessons learned from all those previous reports from every generation.
Without doing anything about it? That's fine and dandy.
Without doing anything. It was meant to say, okay, now we're going to do something about it. Now we're going to put these 99 recommendations into effect. And
good. That's great. Where is that?
It's still waiting to happen. Some things did change, and we'll talk a little bit about that in future episodes. And and also our talking about this is not at all to besmirch the providers of healthcare, mental health providers, many of which, and most of which I would say, do a Herculean job and doing the best they can. But like in my situation, where I'm the only uniform mental health provider on a base, where Marines are coming right out of the sandbox and landing the next day into this rural base in Japan, it was a nightmare. And that was repeated throughout the DoD, at home and as well as abroad.
I wonder, wouldn't it be nice to get one or two of those generals that were on that panel and who made that report and were bathed in the joy of Congress and doing such a great job?
Interesting. Yeah.
How could they live with themselves if
Yeah.
they
Well, I can,
ignorant of how ignorant that was? I don't understand.
yeah. I mean, you can almost say some people have blood on their hands,
Yes, absolutely.
with the rash of suicides and, all the things that happened, a lot of, the harm that was caused by their failing to adhere to their own policies, their own lessons learned. We didn't do that for battlefield medicine. You didn't hear about a medical crisis or a dental crisis, right?
And
Yeah,
not even focusing on the veterans.
right.
And active duty military is getting it in the neck and not being attended to, but the veterans, I mean, get out of here. We're not even
Yeah.
starting on that.
Well, I think we rightly point out that, and this is something that Roosevelt, FDR at the time, that he really emphasizes that the military itself is responsible and obligated to provide the optimal level of psychiatric care before people are discharged from the military.
Mhm.
Because, and that's a definite show in the future we'll be doing on about that executive order from FDR. But he puts the responsibilities on the military and not say, well, we're going to discharge these people who are struggling and send them all to the VA, which has been the policy, right?
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder if you might, in each generation, as we did this research, we uncovered the same lessons learned that kept propping up almost verbatim, some of which were very explicit, like as far as preparation and training and resources. Others were more inferred about what are the things that they're saying that need to be changed. And we identified 10 foundational lessons of war trauma that go across each generation that apply back in 1918 in the First World War and the current conflicts and future conflicts. So I'm wondering if you
Mind
could,
if I read these?
would you please, just go over those?
Yeah. War is inevitable. Inevitably causes a legitimate spectrum of war stress injuries. Okay, if they're inevitable, then we need to prepare for that, right? Did you have more?
Just want to speak on that. A legitimate spectrum of war stress injury, that means that it's more than just PTSD. We often kind of look at, well, what is the psychological effects of war or terrorist act or COVID or something, and we look at whether or not people have PTSD or not. But war stress or traumatic stress injuries involve a whole range of conditions, and PTSD is just one part of that spectrum.
What are some examples then? What in addition to PTSD?
Well, you got, depression. It could be some type of anxiety disorder. It could be some type of a physical complication or what they call medically unexplained medical conditions, such as fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, GERD, headaches, seizures. So all these, a range, a host. I think one study they identified 300 some odd physical conditions that are related to exposure to chronic and extreme and traumatic stress. These are physical health conditions that might, don't reach the criteria for PTSD, but they are manifested in the body in a sense. So there is this, as I said, a spectrum, including psychosis, which is a spectrum. And you may not know this, one of the top diagnoses coming out of Vietnam, the reason why individuals were medevaced out of Vietnam was they were diagnosing as schizophrenia. Now, how many of those people actually had schizophrenia, I think is probably a small fraction. The majority
maybe one or
of
two
it,
symptoms,
they had
essentially symptoms, but
yes, they had symptoms of psychosis. And psychosis was actually part of the symptomatology of the first war syndrome. That was called nostalgia. And this is going back into the 1500s and 1600s in the European armies. And psychosis was a symptom of this syndrome. And in what we call soldier's heart and all these other labels, sometimes you'll see excerpts of psychosis. So again, we don't think of psychosis as usually something that is related to traumatic exposure, but it has always been. And so there's this, I'm sorry to belabor that, but that spectrum is
No,
really
that's,
important to get to, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
very
So,
much.
yep.
So the second, adequate research, planning, and preparation are indispensable during war and peace. Good to know. It's appropriate, certainly. Does it
Yep.
happen? No. A large cadre of well-trained mental health specialists is compulsory. We don't have that.
Don't have
And
that.
we still are not fully,
No,
you know,
no. And by the way, there's an excuse that's often used is that there's a shortage of mental health professionals in the country. And that's true. But the military has ways they could develop that. We have a uniform health services college in the military. And it's used to train like enlisted people and officers into medical professionals. Instead of them being discharged in the military, they go to medical school or dental school or nursing school. And then they come out and they're commissioned and they serve obligated, 4 years or 6 years in military medicine. They started doing that a trickle with mental health. But how many of these enlisted soldiers and sailors, airmen would maybe jump at the opportunity to get free graduate school paid for and then come out as a commissioned officer and provide that service? And with their background as being in the military, that would be an invaluable resource. So we don't use the resources we have available. And as I said, we'll talk more about these concrete solutions going forward. But yeah, we don't have well trained. We know that the training certainly is
yes.
defective, right? Yeah.
For a holistic public health approach to war stress injuries necessitates close collaboration with the private sector. Conferences, private sector, along with full parity between medical and mental health services. Yeah, I mean, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, it's pretty obvious that this is needed, it's important, but it's not happening. Is there any process of making sure it does happen? I haven't heard any holistic public health approach.
No, there isn't. And this really speaks to the transition too, when you transition out of the military, and why we've had such problems with that, is that there isn't this collaboration between the military and the private sector and the VA to make sure people aren't falling through the cracks, particularly those who are reserves or National Guard, who go back to their private lives after they deploy, and their family members. And the idea of full parity between medical and mental health. Wouldn't that be nice? If mental health was treated just like medical conditions, then there would be no stigma.
Yes. Number 5, effective mental health services demand empowered leadership of an independent, unified organizational structure. For example, behavioral health corps would be a nice idea, providing integrated, well-coordinated continuity of care equal to medical services.
Yeah.
You were just talking about the lack of continuity of care when you have a medical diagnosis and you
Right.
go to the VA or nowhere.
Yeah. Well, and the idea of a behavioral health corps, we're going to talk more about that in future episodes, but there's a corps. The military uses corps as a organization to provide for recruiting and for training and policies amongst different corps. And it signals the priorities the military places on this group of professionals that belong to a corps. So we have, for example, a medical corps, a dental corps, a nursing corps, a chaplain corps, a legal corps, a supply corps. We even have a veterinary corps, but there is no behavioral or mental health corps. And if you want to know, I'll give you one quick example of why that's important. When I was on that base in Japan, that Marine base in rural Japan, as the sole mental health provider for 6,000, I was actually, there were a Marine Corps community counseling center that employed 7 different mental health providers who were licensed, who were civilian, but yet they were forbade by instruction to provide care for anything other than some kind of adjustment reaction or a relationship problem, but they could not they could not work with people with PTSD or depression or had suicidal ideation. They all had to be referred to me, the uniform mental health provider. Yeah. So that's the idea. Yeah. So I belong to military medicine, and these community counseling people belong to the base commander or the fleet or the force, right? So there are two different separate chain of commands, two different pipelines, two different sets of policies. And that's what we talk about, needing an integrated organization. We need a core that brings all these people together, because we're creating staffing shortages often because of our policies. Right. We forbade these counselors, licensed counselors, to provide their full, level of training, right, as a licensed mental health provider, their full scope of practice. We say, you can't see these people, you can only see these people. And that creates a staffing shortage.
It's my own 5.
Six.
So it's good. Elimination of mental health stigma, barriers of care, and the disparity is a priority leadership issue at all levels, directly impacting individuals, families, and military readiness. Absolutely.
Yep.
The issues of stigma and related barriers are just, you could have a kid who is interested in seeking what's going on with him or her, but in this case him.
Yes.
And you share that information with other people, and you would, I'm sure, be perceived as, there would be stigma without a doubt. But I'm not sure of today's military. My hope is, but it doesn't seem from, you're skeptical. All right, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you. Well, I told you I've been doing the VA disability exams for
yes,
coming out of the military, so I can tell you, speak to current day, less than 70% ever breached stigma, and then most of them don't talk about, disclose their mental health issues on active duty for fear of stigma and the reprisal against their careers. So yeah, we haven't done a really much of a thing at all with that.
I was hoping, because the current students that we have, including graduate students actually, are far more, I think I mentioned this earlier, far more liberal with regard to mental health issues.
Yeah, and I see that too, but it's an issue where they're maybe more accepting of it personally, individually. But then when you have to go to an organization and tell your NCO or your commander that I think I'm having emotional problems, what's that going to mean? One, how people are going to perceive you. Two, you're not going to be in your career potentially. You're going to lose your security clearance. You won't be able to be deployed potentially. You will be on the exit route. And that's the fear. Even if it's not a reality, that is the ongoing fear that people have, that this is going to come back and bite them. So they might have personal views of being much more progressive about mental health and not carry a stigma, but they're still affected by the organizational stigma that exists.
Yeah, I think that's still the case. I have a very, very good friend of mine who just got out of the Marine Corps as a colonel.
Yeah.
Passed over. Yeah. And he admits he has issues with regard to combat that he's experienced, and is not real impressed with mental health services, and confident that it would be held in confidence and all that. Knows that the various tracks of going on the outside and getting the services potentially that they need, but he calls me, and that's the
right.
That's the time.
Yeah.
And it's very frustrating.
Yeah.
Seeing that after all we have learned, after all we've published.
Absolutely.
And he's among our biggest fans. I mean, but
yeah. But also think of it now, that's a full bird colonel in the Marine Corps. What do you think on the enlisted end of that? Well, how that, or the junior officer folks, if that level of stigma and fear exists at that high ranking, which it does. I've talked to generals and admirals, confidentiality, who had the same struggles, but didn't want to have anybody know about it for obvious reasons. So you can imagine the intense pressure that people feel at lower ranks.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've talked with them actually.
Yeah.
Be sad. Let's see, which number are we on now?
We're on
7?
number 7.
7. Okay. Ensure ready access to high quality mental health services, including definitive care prior to military separation or discharge. Yeah, it was a joke when I was getting out of the Marine Corps in 1967. I guess I actually wasn't, because you automatically go into the reserves.
Hmm.
But the notion of, yes, no's sort of thing, you don't have these things, right? It
Right.
wasn't that obvious, obviously. And I don't think that I did. I mean, I had a great last year at Cherry Point, but it was a vacation compared to where I've been before.
Oh, sure.
But yeah, it wasn't done as well as I had hoped at that time. How about you?
Oh, I didn't. No, heck no. I'm not, you know, I'm that ilk of I'm not going to identify myself as having a problem because I'm a mental health provider, right? Got this facade of,
And you did that when you were an enlisted jet mechanic.
yeah. When I was enlisted, I would not feel free at all to disclose it because I knew in my heart that if I did, one, people would start joking on me and that stigma amongst my peers. But then also, I could be kicked out of the Marine Corps for, not be fully fit for duty or something like that.
Which would have been horrible given your family and your father and all that. And
Yeah.
lots of kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
In my case, I had 2 young boys at home and a wife, and, what was I going to do next? I didn't have a plan. So being kicked out prematurely would have been disastrous. So yeah, there was no incentive whatsoever to come forward in the mid I was having mental health struggles or seeking mental health care, right?
Okay, 8 out of the
Yep.
10.
Okay.
Families must receive adequate mental health and social support during and after military service. And, it rarely, when I'm reading veteran literature, do we ever mention family. So it's absolutely
Absolutely.
critically important. Is there anything that, as an illustration, that you've experienced from family that's supportive, that illustrates how important families are and they have to receive adequate mental health and mental services?
Yeah, well, one of my jobs in the military, and I had that same function here as a private therapist, is I work with children, adolescents, and families. So in addition to adults, active duty, that sort of stuff. And boy, I mean, there was really no resources where you can, we would tell them, well, that your son or daughter need counseling, but if you're overseas base, that's not going to be available as it is maybe in the stateside. But there is such pressure for the families. I had wives and some husbands express the same concern about stigma, that they didn't want to be identified as having problems, or they were very concerned about their spouse who was struggling getting help because they were fearful for that they might lose their job, their position, their source of support for the family. So there's this pervasive fear and uneasiness throughout the military populations about.
Well, it's not only in the military; it's
Oh
in
no.
academia as well,
Oh
to a
yeah.
certain extent. But it's
Absolutely.
gotten much better than the 50 years since I've been in.
Yeah.
So number 9, accurate, regular monitoring and reporting are critical for timely, effective management of mental health needs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's like if you don't know what the problems are, you're not going to be able to respond to it. So let's monitor, how many people are needing care, what's the access to care like. And there have been some 114, I think, different government sponsored studies into military and mental health care during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, many of which overlap, of course, in the recommendations in terms of what problems they identified. So there's a lot of monitoring goes, but there's not a lot of implementation after that too. So that kind of goes to that idea. We need somebody accountable for mental health care who is responsible for implementing some of these reports.
Yeah, behavioral health core.
Yep.
Number 10, robust, dedicated mental health lessons learned policy and programs are integral to meeting present and future needs and prevent crisis.
Yep. How about that?
It seems so obvious.
It does. And it's a nice, I think, kind of a bookend to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show today is, how important are lessons learned to the military, and how we have these programs throughout the military, dedicated policies and personnel whose sole mission is to capture these lessons and disseminate it and implement these lessons learned, but not so for mental health. So we need that badly.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, so that's just a bit of an overview. That's our introduction, and then we didn't even cover a scratch, but hopefully it gives the listeners at least a general view of the landscape of why we took on this task of identifying what are the reasons why the military is neglecting their trauma lessons, and more importantly, what can we do about it? So that will be the discussions in our future shows, but hopefully that was helpful, at least to frame the issues that how we have seen it and how we got started into this.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, I'm hopefully this has been helpful and useful to everybody, and we are, dedicating our own time to doing this because we think it's really important, and we hope that you will tune in, know what the schedule is, be able to listen to it again if you want.
Yep.
But, we're happy to be with you and look forward to many more.
Yeah, I agree everything you said, and also that if people have questions or comments or reactions to anything we said, you can email me, and I'll share that with Charles, of course, at mrussell, RUSSELL PhD @gmail.com. And again, we're not going to talk about clinical issues I recommend you talk to your primary care or you talk to your therapist, but we're going to stick to kind of answering questions and reactions to some of the issues around policies and people's experiences with military mental health care. So until next episode, we wish you all a very good day.
See you guys later.
Bye.